On Friday, voters will go to the polls to decide on whether to remove or to keep the Eighth Amendment from our Constitution.
Murder, can you not see it's murder?
This was the most historically divisive issue in Ireland ever.
We've waited 35 years. We've just 1 week to do it, and we're going to bring it home.
Women are still travelling, women are still in danger.
This government needs to protect women's lives.
We absolutely have to do something.
What they're trying to do is take God out of society.
Sadly, the answer is, we'll just get rid of it instead of, what do you need?
There was that sense that women couldn't be trusted.
And I think the women of Ireland have rolled over for long enough.
Why can't I love glitz and glamour and still feel passionately about women's rights? Imagine if you could get this army of women putting that pressure on and to feel empowered.
Something magical happened where it became a symbol of women's equality in Ireland.
All these stories being somehow set free of trying to change the country.
It's actually about the value that we're putting on women in Irish society.
People do recognise it's a kind of a backlash. What happens here in Ireland will have a knock-on effect.
We are creating an Ireland which values women, our bodies, our choices, ourselves, our lives, absolutely equally.
Hello and welcome to everyone watching tonight. I'm Andrea Horan. I'm the founder of The Unreal Issues and of Tropical Popcorn Nail Bar, which features a little bit in the film. Welcome to the 8th Activating with Joy and Throwing Glitter on an Issue. The reason we had this panel is because, as you might, if you've seen the film, you'll have known, in The Unreal Issues, we always said that we wanted to throw glitter on an issue without minimizing it, and that I started The Unreal Issues after being exposed to a small bit of exposure the girls had in Tropical Popcorn when Catherine Zappone, a politician at the time, came in to get her nails done. And our group chat changed from glitter and glitz and glam into how's the count going at the election? What's the story? What's the constituency recounts like? And it was fascinating to me that this small bit of exposure in a space where the girls were would mobilize them into wanting to be involved in political issues that would become red line issues, particularly when it came to women's rights. So we pulled together a group of people tonight who, during the campaign, I was watching from afar and sometimes near, not in a scary way, who people I admire for what they did. They came to activating and activism in their own way, and they used their own style to do it, to communicate to audiences who would interact with them and the way they have activated. So without further ado, I will introduce you to the panel tonight. First up, we have Richard Malone. He is a multi-award winning designer and artist from County Wexford. He has his work featured in loads of places all over the world, from MoMA in New York, Design Museum in London. And in the lead up to the referendum, he used his fashion credentials to activate in the window of Selfridges. He brought repeal to the catwalks in his show, wore a repeal tee to meet the Queen. Yes, the actual Queen. And he is an absolute ledge bag. We also have Anna Cafolla. She is Days Magazine's digital editor and is a contributor to loads of places, including The Guardian, Prospect, New Statesman, Teen Vogue, Refiner 29, loads. Her work sits at the intersection between youth culture and the personal as political. And during the campaign, she was the co-organizer of Room for Rebellion, a pro-choice clubbing collective based between Ireland and the UK. And she's based between London and Belfast. Welcome, Anna. And last but not least, we have Glamazon Taryn Devere, who, when I first met her, gave me her business card and introduced herself as the joy bringer. I was like, this is a woman I need in my life. She's a writer, a podcaster, a fashion activist, accessories designer, and she brought joy to an often upsetting situation during the referendum with her colourful yet directive headpieces worn to drive home whatever message she was bringing that day. And we can see she has a stunning one now for saying, I love my trans kid. She lives in Donegal now, and some of her activism pieces are in the National Museum of Ireland, and she is the mother of 5 children, and we are delighted to have her here today. Thanks for joining us. I am so delighted. As I said, I've admired your work, all of your work from during the whole time of the campaign and even before that. But what I would like to do maybe is if we could just go through and maybe you could talk about what it was that you did and how you got involved and why you decided to do what you do. So maybe we'll say why you decided to do what you did and then what you did. And we'll start with you, Richard.
With me. Okay. Well, I think that am I on? Is the mic working? I don't know. Like, I think that growing up in, like, especially a non sort of cosmopolitan city, like I'm from Wexford, and we grew up with the conversation of like sexuality and religion because there's like queer people in my family, and we'd had a couple of experiences where what people call working class, which is a term that I find quite tricky now, but like that's kind of the background that we're from. And as the repeal vote sort of approached, I remember like all of the conversations that my mum and my grandmother were having, saying that like it's not an issue if you've got money and like all of these things. It's like £2,000 one family is something that's not the same to the other. And I think that I just became very rageful. And I remember being in the UK and like I studied in London, and like there was a lot of conversations of people saying that like Ireland's still part of the UK, and like no one could believe, like there wasn't information being given out here or like spoken about in any sort of real way. And it was really hard for me to do. Like part of my job is sort of like speaking to journalists or speaking to press after shows and stuff, and like none of those journalists knowing the reality that was happening like literally next door. And I think having that understanding of how knock-on effects for other countries or for other people, or like even, you know, we had the marriage referendum, and I just remember like everyone I think was very enraged and very like, what's the right word, like we were all willing to fight for something, and like we'd seen that you can make a change happen. And I think it just came very naturally from like the core of my family. Like they're very powerful women, and I think in those situations it's not about like your job or your role, but they very much run the household. And like as my mother was raising boys, and like all of her sisters were raising boys too, but women's issues were like always a part of the conversation, and like we weren't embarrassed about it or anything. And I think I always felt a bit robbed of like conversations around like sexuality or safe sex because of the way schooling and education is in Ireland. And I think that it all just sort of, I just remember like speaking to anyone I could in England about it because no one knew about it. And even my closest circle of friends were like, what the fuck is going on? Like, how can that be a thing? And I think here it was just, there's so much disbelief around it. And I think that it's such a reality in Ireland. And like so many people grow up with the conversations like from a young age. And I'm sure a lot of people know, like personally, I know a lot of like young kids now and who are a bit older who like, it wasn't a choice whether to have them or not. So there's very young mothers who were my friends and stuff. And I just think like it's this horrible idea of like a sort of patriarchal capitalist society, like controlling women and then restricting any choice. And like those choices carry on through the rest of your life, and it feeds into education. It feeds into this sort of horrible network of decisions that you're restricted from because of that. And I think generally that's why I went a bit wild and did it was first the sort of letter for Vogue, and then all the Queenie stuff, all of that happened then as well.
Tell us what it was. Describe it.
Well,
you wrote a letter for Vogue.
Yeah, well, originally what was interesting about the two things is like I'd done this open letter and it was supposed to be published, I think, in a newspaper, and the newspaper pulled it because they didn't think that, I don't know, for whatever reason, they thought it was too controversial or it wouldn't sit with their readers. And it's a big newspaper here, like one of the biggest, one of the ones that I read. And then it was actually one of the female journalists from the New Vogue who was like, we'll run it, like absolutely we'll do it. And they let me write whatever, there was no edits. And it was just a very personal perspective thing on like why it's non-negotiable for me. And then at the same time, Selfridges had asked me to take over their corner shop, which is their big window that faces Oxford Street. And I think they wanted like some sort of lovely sort of showpieces or whatever. And then we showed up with like all of these like information that's readily available on the internet, so I couldn't see a problem. And then I started writing it in the window, and we actually had my friends from London who had personal experiences with it, like, and it wasn't the same experience you have in Ireland. It was like them actually why they would choose to have an abortion, or like what it's like, or just a very open conversation, which I still to this day can't see a problem with. And then Selfridges came downstairs and like shut it down. It became this big controversial thing, and I took my stuff out of Selfridges then, and it was like it just became a bit like loaded. And then what pissed me off the most is the next day they had an installation about like the effect of knife crime on men, and I was like, I wasn't even like saying I'm pro, I was literally just sharing the information. And then I like wore the repeal t-shirt for the catwalk thing. I was living in it at that stage because of work, and I was always wearing it. And then when I met the Queen, Liz, I wore it. And I wore a little badge thing as well to meet her. She didn't actually speak to me about that, but it was a bit like, it's a weird thing to meet the Queen. And I didn't expect a conversation about repeal, but I did have a conversation with it about her dresser, Angela, who's like her best mate. And she phoned my grandmother, my mum at home to give her support, which I thought was pretty cool. Even though my grandmother missed the call because she's watching Emmerdale, and my mum had to pick it up, which is quite low. But yeah, it was just anything that I could do, I would do. And then like, that's quite public facing, but like going home with my grandmother, who she was 80, she had been 82 at the time, and she like literally painted repeal in acrylic paint in the back of her car. And we were driving around, like talking to everyone about it. And it was amazing. It was just like, I really thought it was going to happen. And then like, I think everyone had that experience where as I drove out of Dublin, like down to Wexford to vote, the amount of signs that were like not pro-choice blew my mind. And that's when I started like shitting myself. So we went on sort of mad rampages of campaigning and chatting and phoning. And yeah, and everyone had the same response, I think, that we spoke to anyway.
Amazing. Anna, what's your story? Where did you come to repeal, and what made you start to run the Room for Rebellion?
Hello. Can you hear me okay? Yes.
Yeah, perfect.
Yes. So I am from an accent from the north, and I very much grew up in a very went to big Catholic school in Belfast, was constantly surrounded by anti-choice. You know, like we had those like anti-choice North of Ireland groups coming into our school and giving us like misinformation for our sex education, like the stuff I grew up believing, I'm sure like a lot of people here know was not okay, especially around abortion and abortion access. And it really took, it was whenever I was out of school and going to university. I went to university in Belfast, and then I moved to London, and maybe whenever I started really questioning like my identity as an Irish woman, and kind of being confronted with, like Richard was saying, like the lack of knowledge that people have in England to what women in the North and the South were going through, and just, you know, having conversations with people, with, you know, young English women, liberal, progressive, who just had absolutely no idea. And it really like just shook me to my core. It would be people as well who would be so vocal about Planned Parenthood in America, or the lack of abortion rights elsewhere, but, you know, just across the pond, what was the atrocities that were going on there were completely not on their radar. And it was my wonderful friend, Isis O'Regan, founded Room for Rebellion in 2016, and we kind of struck up this online friendship around our interests in abortion rights activism. And actually the first time we met each other in real life was on the steps of the Irish Embassy, and Isis was reciting a poem for Savita into a microphone, and I was just spellbound by this incredible, powerful Irish woman. And we got to work with the second Room for Rebellion event, which was across London, Belfast, and Dublin. and they were all live streamed to each other live on the nights, and we had different DJs who were kind of into the cause, and not just Irish DJs from everywhere, and it was just really important for us with Room for Rebellion, I think, bringing that community aspect of club culture into our activism. And we've always been inspired by parties and clubbing as a form of resistance. There's so many different parties that have, people's very existence is an act of resistance, and the joy that they bring to that. We've always been really inspired by club nights like Chapter 10, PDA, Hungama. Like, the history of dance music is the history of radical social political change, and that goes from like the discos in the 70s of queer Black origins, or the anti-Thatcherism of 90s acid house, and right up to today, like groups like Disc Woman would be inspiring us, and intersectional feminism there. And that was something that we just wanted to bring our pro-choice activism to, and have those conversations in the smoking area with people, and then diving into sweaty East London club. That it's like creating a space for people. We always use this term like angry dancing, like dancing for rebellion and dancing for our body autonomy. And it was just a wonderful opportunity to bring people together to raise money in the way that we did for Abortion Support Network. And yeah, like I said, I've cultivated some of my best friendships with people through abortion rights activism, and that was always really at the heart of what we were doing for Room for Rebellion. And I think for us, just activism can take many forms, and the dance floor is a space for those political and social conversations. And I think over the years we really had the opportunity to harness that, and I will never forget being on that dance floor and the final results coming through, and hugging my best friends as that came through was really a thunderous moment for us. So yeah, that was, maybe I've rambled a little bit here.
Not at all. Do you think, though, because you're creating a space and bringing people to where they go naturally and then having the conversation, that it makes it easier to sometimes start a conversation or maybe get involved in a conversation that may be a bit more difficult in a different time or place?
Yeah, because I remember like people would come to the door of like we'd be in this little club in like Hackney Wick. People come to the door and just like hear a really banging party going on and like pay in, and then you'd be chatting to them in the smoking area and they'd be like looking at the flyers and being like, oh wait, what? Like, and having these really fruitful conversations with people, and they come back, like you build a loyalty and they follow the brand. And it's I think it's really important, overall, that we can't run at this like base level of anger and exhaustion that was going to be inevitable in what was a really prolonged and hard fought campaign, and bringing that joy and open communication around an issue like abortion rights and reproductive health care is so vital, and bringing as many people as we can as possible in and doing it on the dance floor can be a way to do that.
Speaking of joy, our joy bringer there, Taryn Devere, maybe you might tell us how you started activating the way you did.
So I always say that my my fashion activism began because of laziness, because my arms get really like tired holding signs. So I was like, and especially when you're coming from Donegal and you're going to Dublin and you're like carting a sign around with you in Dublin all day and whatever. And so I was like, there has to be an easier way to do this. And so I started making signs and putting the signs on my head. But also that, the other side of it is that I'm an artist and a visual person. But I also have a background in PR as well. So I was really aware of the types of visual images that would be striking for press photographers and what press are interested in. And so I sort of deliberately set about to create some pieces of work that would catch the attention of the press, because one of the things I found when I first came to Ireland was that people wear a lot of grey and they wear a lot of black and they wear a lot of navy, and there's not a lot of colour. And when you're trying to catch a good image for the media, like, you want the crazy, you want the colour, you want the fun. And so I noticed with the water chargers, I was like, this is just the most boring ever. So in the water chargers movement, I started dressing outrageously, and I ended up in all the papers. And so I was like, right, that's what I'll do. And it wasn't because I wanted it to be me, or, you know, it wasn't about me. It was about the message. So I ramped it all up a lot when in Donegal we put up all our yes signs. They all went up, and the next day the anti-choices had taken all our yes signs down. And I got really angry about this because, you know, we had raised money for these signs and people had put a lot of effort and time into putting the signs up, and they weren't even sort of allowing our signs to be there, and all their signs would turn up where our signs had been. So I decided, okay, well, I'm just going to be the sign. So I started a very deliberate kind of campaign of being the sign. Every single day that I left my house, I had something repeal on my head, or like I made a necklace out of repeal badges. I had like 50 repeal badges on it, different things that I created. And then I found that I started posting pictures each day of my different outfits, and that was sort of bringing joy to people and encouraging people to sort of do something similar. So this sort of dress for repeal hashtag started on Twitter, and I created like a repeal album, and it sort of went from there, really. I kept ramping it up. and I forgot about the pro-choice princess. She was kind of my first one. I did the pro-choice princess for one of the early ARC marches. And I created these little cards that said that the pro-choice princess is bestowing bodily autonomy on you. And I dressed as a princess, and I handed these out to all the people who were at the march and the people on the streets. And so just little sort of performance art pieces and different ideas and things to get people thinking. I created a dress that said, "Who owns a woman's body?" I always remember wearing it in Marks and Spencer's in Letterkenny, and having all these like middle-aged men coming over, and like they just stand in front of me and just look me up and down and just sort of look at me for a really long time. And then, you know, I would be having to spend a lot of energy trying to gauge whether they were a friendly person or whether they were a frightening person, because I definitely encountered
we're
wearing my
I think we're having a little internet moment there. Are you back?
Mm-hmm.
Try now.
Me?
Yeah.
Are we good? Can you hear me? Oh yeah, okay. Sorry. Where did you lose me at?
The man staring at you, looking you up and down.
Okay, yeah. It's just saying that I had some really positive reactions, but I also had some really negative and scary reactions.
We'll try turning your video off for a moment and see if we get a better thing. But in the meantime, Richard, you were obviously operating in the fashion sphere, and do you think that bringing your message to the audience that was around you brought them in with you and brought it to a new audience? Or because I often feel like the power is going to people where they are, and that you can then, people feel comfortable then to engage with you in that space, and then they'll come on where you are eventually, bit by bit. Was that something you found, or am I making that?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, like, naturally as a person, I'm very sort of private, and I don't know, like, I'm not really comfortable with being vulnerable, and I have kind of one foot in the fashion door and one foot out of it. I can see all the problems with it. It's something that, like, I'm not afraid to talk out about. And I think for me, it was like a matter of being vulnerable and like telling people about what's going on in like a very real and human way. And then people always respond to that. And even when they were like, like writing this letter thing for Vogue, it was like I think when you write things like that, you can only write it from your perspective, and that's the only one that you can speak on. And framing it for people, I think, allows them in. Like, it's like a way in, and it's an invitation to open a dialogue, and it's not trying to isolate them, you know. And that's one of the things that I find, again, like with the clubbing thing, people are so open when you go into these spaces, and like fashion spaces are very like protective, and people are kind of arseholes a lot of the time, and like everyone's rushing between shows. But if you can get someone sort of outside of that, which is when Repeal fell, people were really willing to listen. And like I was quite not pushy, but like if I really wanted someone to listen, like I think they did and they would. And it's the same thing with the clubbing is like, and Hungama I'm really familiar with, like one of my best friends runs it, and I'm like, it's just these invitations, and that's like a really human thing. And I think if you want something to change, you have to take a little bit of responsibility for that. And like also that, you know, when we were campaigning, or like when I did the open letter, a lot of people didn't like that, and like men mainly didn't like it. They didn't like a man's perspective on it, and they didn't like the fact that it was in support of it. And I'm sure they're not like the kind of men I know are in my life, but it was like, you know, sort of middle-aged Irish men and older who were kind of sharing their stories of, if women had rights to abortion, then my nephew who has like some disability wouldn't have been born. And I'm like, that's categorically a lie. Like it doesn't restrict anyone's, like it doesn't make everyone get an abortion, it just gives them a choice. And like that's kind of the conversation that people, I feel like I kept having throughout. And even like my aunts are quite religious, like they're pretty Catholic, and they were like quite judgmental when they said, and like one of my cousins, she had the conversation, she was like, if I'd had the choice, I'm not sure I would have had a daughter at 15. Like, why would I do that? Like, and that's the thing. And I think that that's a very human thing to hear. Like, and I think that that's everyone at that point, what I recognized in them was like this like massive vulnerability of people sharing their stories, but in a really empowering way. Like no one was like, I'm a victim. Everyone was just like, this is total shit. And like the more that you share it, the more power that you get, I think. And that's kind of what the logic was.
Were you nervous that it might have an impact on your business and your brand?
No. And it did. Like it did in a way with the Selfridges thing, because we were stocked in Selfridges and then we weren't. So I think in that sense it did, but also like sometimes when you're trying to take someone along with you, the start of that journey is like a bit chaotic and like it's a bit angry and it's a bit, you know, they were just really pissed off that I'd, as they said, commandeered the space. And I was like, you literally invited me to, like, I didn't like break into Selfridges, like you just asked me to, like. And also it's this thing that happens when you're an artist or a designer, people have expectations on you, and like they want you to be, they kind of fetishize people. They're like, well, you're the Irish one or the poor one or the working class one, like, or if you want to have a chat about like queer rights or you want to talk about women's rights, it's not really your place, and people feel uncomfortable when you do that. But I was nervous, but I would rather be on the right side of history, and I feel like you kind of owe it to people. Like I was along for the journey with the marriage referendum with my whole family, who were like, you know, massive gay fans, so to speak, like everyone. So I was like, we have to do this, and we were all on board, and it couldn't have been any other way in my eyes.
Anna, how would you say, if you were to give advice to people who wanted to activate in their own way, what would be the best steps for them to do that? Like, where do you start when it comes to finding your niche?
I think it's you know, that what Richard was saying as well, it's about that kind of like open vulnerability and, you know, having difficult conversations with people and just like having an open heart and putting yourself out there. Like, I think approaching conversations where, you know, there's so many people surprised me, like, over the years, to be honest. I mean, there were times where there were quite hard, you know, scary moments with people, you know, if you're being confronted by like anti-choicers, and especially in Belfast even still. But I think there's been moments of like surprise and you know, people sharing stories with you because of your openness, you know, whether it's in a smoking area or on the streets of a protest. that I think, sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but I think tips for, it's finding your community out there. And, your community can be on Twitter, it can be like in the club space, it can be, on the art course you're on. It's just like being open-hearted and looking for that support network to be able to build yourselves up and make that network.
And I suppose it's kind of about not being afraid to go into spaces that aren't traditionally activism spaces, like
yes, I think there were times where we had like pushback about what we were doing with Room for Rebellion, or that we were that it was a bit frivolous, or like it wasn't appropriate from people that also it did surprise me, having that kind of, not a backlash, but like a little bit of resistance to the idea. But I would do it over and over and over again.
How did you deal with that backlash?
I think it was just like I remember like the party that we were planning to have on the day that we did, the results were coming through, and it was like, oh well, what if things turn out badly and we don't have what we want? And it's like, well, we're all together and we're there in a space that we feel comfortable in, and we're around people that we love and that all have the same mission in mind. So whatever happens, we're in it together, and we have this community here. I think, there was a little bit of resistance in that time to, oh, is this something to celebrate? Even from people who were, very fervent pro-choice activists. I think, it's just, again, just to like ramble and repeat myself, it's like finding your community and like holding those people really close and just being open-hearted and inviting people in.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to be said for, I suppose, the joy to be found in that community and in that activism. And as you said before, like the long journey of campaigning is a hard one. And if you can do things that make it more joyful, more comfortable, and more enjoyable in itself, that's something in itself in terms of campaigning.
Yeah, and I think as well, like just to kind of go back to a point, Richard, that you were making about with Selfridges, I think like what you said about they did the installation about knife crime the next day. I think there's across like because as a journalist as well who would write on like fashion and culture, one thing that can concern me sometimes is the co-option of activism and like activist sensibilities by like these big corporations or brands, that are like okay to like stick a rainbow flag on something for Pride season and then never think about it again, or where's that money going to, or like really palatable, like sanitized forms of activism. Like sometimes it's really messy and sometimes it's really complicated and things are going to be really tough. And I think there's like nuances to it that we like can't forget, and we can't let like capitalist corporatist spaces corporatize our issues that can be messy and far-reaching.
Taryn, hopefully your Wi-Fi is joyous again for us. Because we operated in a space that was so joyous and that was so colourful and fun, that there is the chance that it can be seen as frivolous. Did you ever feel like what you were doing was any less important than like a more, shall we say, serious approach to campaigning? Oh, you're on mute.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I did get a lot of pushback and people saying that what I was doing wasn't appropriate. Did I feel that way? No, I don't think I did. I think I was like, I think there's a space for everybody to bring their own individual way to approach any particular topic. And when you're an activist, I don't see it as like, I'm an activist for this hour of my life. I see it as like, I'm an activist all the time. And so, yeah, when I am doing my grocery shopping, I am being an activist. And that is the perfect place for me to be presenting in my activist attire and doing my fashion activism. You know, I want the people who are shopping in Lidl to see me in my fashion activism outfit, because they're people that other parts of the campaign might not be able to reach necessarily. So I think too, that's a big learning that I had, was that every approach is valuable, and the campaigns that have a really broad range of approaches will work better, because one approach and one campaign, like if we had just had Together for Yes and not had anything else but that, we probably wouldn't have got repeal, because you need a broad range of approaches. You need everybody's different approach is going to hit with different people. So I think, yeah, you know, finding your space, your joy space about what works for you. And obviously, you know, I like color, I like creativity, I like wearing silly things on my head. So that was my way in, and that was the way that that I worked with it. And I also felt that, especially in the last few weeks of the campaign, I felt that morale was really dropping a lot, and people were really fearful, and people were starting to really panic and worry that we weren't going to win. And so I kind of self-appointed myself as the morale booster, and kind of went online every day to post a colorful picture and to like tell everybody that we were going to do it and why we were going to do it. So I think that too in itself had value, just even in kind of keeping people's morale up. And so, yeah, I think there's just lots of different ways to approach any particular subject, and I don't think any of them are really wrong.
Do you think that there is space within like main campaigns to bring joy and fun into it, or do you think that that is better left up to the individual to do?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think that the more fun and joy you can bring to something, the more it will hit. Like, to my mind, positive messaging works better than negative messaging. So, you know, the other side had the downside already, because they were vote no and we were vote yes. So we already had a positive. But a lot of our messages, you know, which like Together for Yes did positive messages around care and compassion and stuff like that. It's a bit of a challenge, isn't it? Like, I found it a huge challenge because I try and just put positivity out into the world. So I found that really challenging with coming up with the messaging for some of my headpieces, and not all of them did. Like, I felt quite angry that I felt the press wasn't really talking about how several women, and possibly more that we don't know about, actually died as a result of the 8th Amendment. And I got really upset about that. And so that's why I created a headpiece that said, you know, women have died because of the 8th Amendment. Now, I did put on the back of a headpiece. It wasn't the front message. But generally speaking, I try and always have a positive spin. But the other thing that I did too during the campaign, which was a kind of piece of performance art, which was very spur of the moment, was we had a thing here in Donegal and Derry where the anti-choicers, who obviously are very active in this area, had put up 17,000 white crosses on the road from Letterkenny to Derry. And I drove to Derry the day that happened, the morning it happened. I was driving, and I actually felt like physically sick seeing these crosses. And I felt like really violated and really distressed. And it just sat with me. I was in Derry for meetings and stuff. And on the way home, because like every good activist, I always have the markers in my car, the markers and the scissors and the posters ready to write in case I come across a protest. I had markers in my car. I stopped and I wrote the names of some of the women who had died because of the 8th Amendment on the white crosses. Because I was like, no, you are not having this as you're like all these little babies dying. I was like, no, we need to talk about the women who have died. The women need to be at the center of this, you know? So like, it's hard to make dead women, you know, a kind of joyful prospect. So I think that there is a big challenge in for activists in trying to find the way in. But sometimes I think it's as simple as just, let's do something where we're all wearing bright colors. Let's all wear red or whatever. That people have done that kind of thing, Extinction Rebellion, whatever. It's powerful. It looks good. It creates a strong message. So I do think that there's ways in with that.
Anna, there was conversations about the campaigns and that there was minorities maybe excluded. Do you think that by having more creative ways of campaigning and activism, that it might make campaigns more inclusive and maybe messages that can't be led by the main campaign can be brought in that way?
Yeah, I think so. On days in the lead up to the vote, I ran an editorial campaign called Ireland Unfree, and it was an editorial series that kind of followed different factions of the pro-choice movement. It was written by Irish writers, Irish illustrators, and some of the stories that came out of that, you know, there was a story about men's voices in the movement and why that was important. There was a story about specifically people of faith and particularly young people of faith and their intersection of their faith identity and their pro-choice activism. There was a piece about comedy and comedians, you know, using their shows and their art form to bring it to new audiences. I think positioning people. There was also a piece about deaf and disabled people and their part in the campaign and elevating those marginalized voices. And I think even in the activism that we see today, like I'm really thinking about like the climate crisis movement, which is obviously climate change is the most urgent issue of our time, and it is going to be for the next couple of years. And that's a movement that has, for a couple of years now, you know, been dominated in the media by the kind of white middle class activists, and we see more and more now that there's Indigenous people being put to the forefront with their activism, you know, with the Dakota Pipeline, people in Colombia. I think more and more centering marginalized voices where possible is vital for us to be doing in these movements that affect us. And I think it's, you know, for me at the moment, it's most clear in movements around the climate crisis.
I'm going to ask all of you, just before we go, what bringing your personal way of activism to the campaign did for, like, obviously the benefits are of bringing it over the line and thing, but what did it bring to your life personally by doing that? Richard, you can kick it off.
It was just a really lovely sense of optimism, and even like the action of fighting for something that's really important. There's a really amazing camaraderie that I think people really miss, and I miss that, you know, moving from like a rural sort of villagey vibe to London. It's so isolating, and like having that community is really inspiring, and you can literally see within that people's perspectives shift. And I think it's a really positive, like, act of love to watch someone's opinion change. And like I mean that with like my great aunts or my aunties and uncles and stuff, like seeing them change, like even with the 17,000 crosses thing, you know, like seeing their opinion go from like 17,000 dead babies to like actually 17,000 embryos, and then 17,000 women that actually got to live a life safely and fulfilled. And that's the shift that happened in very real time. And I think it was like a point in, like, I feel like Ireland's history where everyone was together in it. And that's such an inspiring thing to take with you into your life and to know that it can happen. I think it was amazing. And I think it's like the most rewarding thing to have those conversations. And again, like, be open and be vulnerable. And like, at the end of the day, it's only the truth that people were sharing. So I think that that's a really optimistic thing to take with you to the rest of your life.
Anna?
Yeah, definitely that optimism and hopefulness, and like forging a community. Like I've said already, like some of my best friends are people that, you know, I have been a part of in the pro-choice movement, and people that I will be friends with for life. And we have a really, really deep bond from what we went through together and, you know, weathered the storm. And it's people that we're going to continue weathering the storm with, because, you know, we know on the island of Ireland that free, safe, legal, local abortion care isn't available for all. So we have to keep up that momentum together and that hopefulness and optimism that we can change it. And, you know, I think I really feel that sense of community. And even I remember, you know, I'd be on the tube and I'd see someone with a repeal jumper on and I'd be like, you know, my gal across the platform. I think, yeah, keeping that momentum and that hopefulness up is, you know, 3 years on, something that we do, you know, because still with the North, we're getting there. And, you know, being all in it together is so important.
And Taryn?
Yeah, I think for me, it gave me a sense of feeling included, because living in Donegal and being a lone parent of so many kids, I wasn't able to really be part of a lot of the groups that were happening and a lot of the events that were happening. And I had to find my own way in, and I had to find a way to feel like I was a part of it. So for me, it gave me a great way in, and it gave me a great sense of the community. And yeah, I did get to meet people, of course, at different events and stuff like that I was able to get to. But it's up there in like the top 3 things that I've ever done in my life, and things that I've been involved in, and things that I feel like we all made such a powerful difference and a powerful change. And I'm just so proud of the work that we all did together. Like I just think it's what we did is so amazing. And I'm getting teary thinking about it, because I weep at the drop of a hat. But it was just beautiful. And you also had that thing of, like Anna said, you know, you'd be going down the streets and you'd see somebody in a repeal jumper or a repeal necklace or whatever. And it was like, immediately, we're friends. You know?
Amazing. Richard Malone, Anna Cafolla, Taryn Devere, it was an absolute pleasure to spend some time with you and to talk with you tonight. And thank you for everything that you did. And thanks for joining us at home, everyone.